These are the supplies I will be using in today's tutorial. You can find a list of them in the video description. These are the paint colors I will be using today. You don't need these exact colors, just get somewhere close. Also in the video description is a line drawing and reference photo for you to download. Print the line drawing at the scale you plan on painting it. On the back of the line drawing, take a pencil and apply graphite all over the back of the image. Position it on top of your watercolor paper and tape it in position so it doesn't shift. This will allow you to then trace the subject using a ballpoint pen, and with just the pressure of your pen, you will be able to actually transfer the entire line drawing to your watercolor paper. Once you've done this, just set your line drawing aside. When you initially do your transfer, you may have some lines that are lighter and some that are darker. With the transparency of watercolor paints, it's important that we lighten these pencil lines so they don't show up in the finished painting. I like to use a kneaded eraser to do this. I'm not going to completely erase the lines. Instead, I want to simply tap the pencil lines with my kneaded eraser so it picks up the graphite, making them a lighter gray. If you have any smudges, which would be a result of just resting your hand on your watercolor paper during the tracing process, you can also erase those smudges at this time as well. Since I will be using a lot of yellows in this particular subject, I'm making sure my lines are nice and light. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Now we can begin mixing our paint colors. Get your large brush, make sure it's clean, and use it to carry as much water as it will hold over to a few different wells on your paint palette. One of the main colors I will be using in today's painting is cadmium yellow. I'd also like to use a yellow that is a little bit more golden, so I'm going to add cadmium yellow to a second location on my palette. And to make it a little bit more earthy and golden in color, I'm going to add a little bit of Purple Lake. I don't want to add too much or it'll go straight to brown. But by adding just a little bit of the complementary color, I'm able to give it a little bit more of a natural color. The next color I'm going to need is a cadmium orange. The cadmium orange is very bright right out of the tube. The second orange I need is a little bit more of a red orange. So I'm going to add this cadmium orange to an additional area on my palette so I can add some of the cadmium red to it. Now, if you're confident with your paint mixing abilities, you don't have to mix your colors in advance. But if you're just starting out, sometimes it's nice to just have all of the colors mixed up and ready to go so you don't ever have to pause midway to establish your colors. So to make that red-orange, I'm just adding a little bit of that cadmium red to my cadmium orange. One of the next colors I'm going to make is a green. So I'm going to gather some of my sap green, and I want this green to be a pretty powerful color. So I'm going to grab quite a bit of pigment so I can establish a darker value. Now, if you would like your green to be a little bit more of an olive green, you can add just the tiniest bit of its complementary color, which would be red. So to create an olive green, you're going to want 90% green and just a very small 10% of the cadmium red. If you add too much red, it's going to go straight to brown. So add in small increments until you are happy with the color. And then last but not least, we are going to create a darker cadmium red with just a little bit of the purple lake for the stem of the leaf. This will create just a little bit of a burgundy. Once you have your colors mixed up, rinse your brush really good and begin applying clean water to just the inside of your leaf. Now, these maple leaves have a lot of different ins and outs. It's a really unique shape. So just take your time along that outer edge. If you find it helpful, you can even tint your water with the smallest amount of yellow to make it easier for you to see so you don't accidentally go outside the shape of your leaf. And if you do, it's no big deal. Every leaf has a slightly different shape. I'm being very heavy-handed with the amount of water I'm applying because I know if I'm not heavy-handed, by the time I fill the entire leaf with water, the area where I started will already be dry. So I have to put a good amount initially on this paper. When I look back on areas that I've already applied water to, if I see that they're beginning to dry, I simply take a wet brush over to those areas and tap my brush so it releases some of the water to reestablish the moisture. Now you can tell that I have been very heavy-handed with the amount of water. However, there are a few low points in my paper that are creating puddles. So before I bring in the paint colors, I want to dry my brush off on a sponge, and I just want to tap my dry brush on the surface of these thicker water puddles to even out the water. I want everything to be very glossy and wet, but I want the water to be thin enough so that I can see the texture of my watercolor paper. If the water is so thick that it's puddling and dripping, that's going to make it very difficult for me to control where my paint colors go. Now that the puddles are soaked up, but everything is still very glossy, nothing is dry, I can begin adding my color. Now, although these are all beautiful fall colors, I need to keep in mind that some, when mixed, may create more browns than I may necessarily want. So with that in mind, I have to keep in mind that red and green are going to make a brown. My orange and green are going to make some sort of brown. So I need to kind of get these colors in, but avoid stacking them so my colors remain vibrant and I don't get just a brown leaf. So I'm going to begin with my cadmium yellow. This is the more vibrant yellow that does not have the added purple lake. And slowing down on my edges to make sure I have a nice, clean, neat product. I'm not worried so much about the inside of my leaf just yet. I want to make sure I get these edges in before they begin to dry. Sometimes I'll rest my hand on my pinky just for stability without allowing the palm of my hand to completely touch the surface of my paper. When I get into these little points of the maple leaf, I really try to use less pressure and hold my brush more vertical, which allow me to get into those small spaces. There are some areas of my leaf that are already beginning to dry. So I need to pick up my pace a bit. If you have it very fine water mister, you can spritz the surface of your leaf just to establish the water, giving you more working time. But I find that if you just get your base color in quick enough, it'll actually reestablish the moisture for you. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Now that I have yellow all the way around the outer edges, I'm going to take a moment to just kind of spread this water with a little bit of additional yellow to fill in the rest of the leaf. This is a way just to kind of resaturate things. Everything is still very glossy. So I can now begin to add the additional colors I would like. For that, I'm going to switch to a smaller brush so I have more control of how much paint I'm introducing. So I'm going to switch to my number 6 round. I'm going to make sure it's wet, but I'm going to dab off the excess water. And I'm going to fully load this brush with my olive green. But before I go to my paper, I'm going to wipe it off on the rim so I can avoid puddles. Now, one of the best parts about a fall leaf is you can kind of let the paint create texture, and it's just going to add to your subject. So I am tapping my brush lightly. And this is just layer 1 of multiple. So try to remind yourself that although it may not be perfect just yet, this is the very beginning. So you got to be easy on yourself. I'm taking my wet brush directly into my sap green so I can get a little bit more vibrancy in some of these greens. And I'm going back over some of them because I know from experience that these greens are going to lighten up by about 20% in value. So if I want vibrant color, I need to make sure that my colors are darker than the way I would like them to appear once the paint dries. So I'm embracing the texture. I'm just kind of going over parts of where I established some greens earlier. Now I'm going to rinse my brush and I'm going to grab some of the cadmium orange that I've mixed up. But after I load my brush, I want to really wipe my brush off on the rim of my palette well to avoid puddling. And I want to avoid stacking my oranges with the greens because that's just going to create excess browns. And although they wouldn't be bad and it would still look fine, I just want a little bit more vibrancy in my leaf. So a lot of browns is not my personal goal. There are areas of my leaf that are already beginning to dry and they've lost their sheen. So I may be getting some blooms and textures that are a little unexpected. However, I find that blooms and textures simply help with the fall leaf. So I'm not going to fight it. So I'm still continuing to kind of go around some of my greens just to get some color in here. The areas that have lost their gloss, I know I need to stay out of them if I want to minimize the amount of texture I have. But I am going to grab some of those golden yellows where we added the purple lake to the cadmium yellow. And I'm just going to add some texture to the areas that are still wet with the vibrant yellow. I can overlap these golden yellows on top of some of my greens. But this is just going to create a little bit of age spots. And then last but not least, I'm going to grab that red orange and I'm going to be selective, staying in the areas that are very glossy yet. And where your paper is glossy, it may be different from mine. So don't feel like you have to put your colors in the exact place I did. Just avoid overlapping your reds with your greens if you want to minimize the amount of browns that show up in your leaf. A lot of times, less is more. So I really take a pause and ask myself, is more color necessary or am I happy with the way it's looking as is? And right now, I feel happy with that as the first layer. So while that is drying, I'm going to switch to a small brush. This is just a number 2 round. I'm going to make sure it's clean and I'm going to dab off the excess water on a sponge or paper towel. And I'm going to fully load my brush with that burgundy red we mixed up earlier. And I'm just tapping off a little bit of the excess paint to avoid puddles. And I'm going to now paint the stem of this leaf. And I'm painting wet on dry for the stem. I just started close to the leaf and I'm slowly working my way outward. Once I begin this process, I avoid backtracking into the area where I started my stem. That will just help avoid some of the textures. if you would like, and you still have some small sections where your leaf is glossy, you can take some of this Burgundy red and you can push some of your reds to be just a little bit darker. Just make sure you stay where things are glossy and have not started to dry. Now I'm going to let this entire leaf dry before I do details on top. Now that everything is dry, we can begin adding details to the veins of the leaf and painting these details using wet on dry. So I'm continuing with my small number 2 round. And I'm going to simply pull a little bit of my red orange to a new area of my palette, and I'm going to water this down. I want this to be a nice, soft value. I don't want it to be too extreme. So, for example, when I mix this color, it's very light, okay? And the reason I'm doing that is because not all veins are the same value. I think one of the common mistakes people make is they get to this stage of their leaf and then they paint all veins the same color and value, when in reality, that's not the case in real nature. Every vein has its own color and its own value. So I am starting with the lightest veins first, and I am holding my brush very vertical and keeping my pressure with my brush nice and light. And I'm finding just the lightest veins first to add some color to. The trick is to try and paint the veins while bending the bristles of your brush minimal. Notice how I'm kind of skipping around. I'm not painting every single vein. I am finding just the ones that are lighter in color and lean towards more of a red. It can be challenging to get those thin, narrow lines. Just keep your pressure nice and light and hold your brush vertical. Point the handle of your brush up to the ceiling, and that's going to really help you get those thinner lines. And if your hand shakes and wobbles, that's okay. Embrace it. Veins don't have to be perfect. Give them some texture. So I'm taking a moment to pause, see if there are any other veins that I would like to paint with this particular color. If I'm happy with the ones I've painted, then I can move on to the next color. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use some of the green for the veins. I would like this green to be a little less olive. So I'm getting more sap green. And I want this green to be on the more vibrant side. So this is not as watered down. But I've made sure to tap my sponge and wipe it off on the rim so I'm not overloaded with the amount of paint that's on my brush. So I'm holding my brush vertical as much as possible. A lot of times it's helpful to start at one of the larger veins and then work your way out. And as you work your way out, move your brush and then lift up so you get a tapered thin end to your line work. Notice how some of my lines don't completely trace the entire vein. Sometimes they stop short, and that's because that's what happens in nature as well. Sometimes it's just part of a vein that is that color. Make sure you're stopping from time to time to look at your reference photo before just jumping in. It's easy to go on autopilot and make every vein in the same color. So just encourage yourself to pause and ask yourself, is it just part of the vein that's that color? Is it the whole vein? Give yourself time to interpret the reference photo. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm going to grab a little bit of that burgundy color. I'm wiping my brush off on the rim and lightly tapping my sponge so that my brush is only semi-loaded with the paint color. The reason I'm doing that is because it's easy to overload your brush with paint. And then when you go to pull a thin line, it actually is a very thick, wide line, and your brush wants to drop a large amount of that color down on your paper. So I'm making a point to really wipe the brush off on the rim of my palette and even go a step further to tap a paper towel or sponge gently with your brush to ensure that you don't have too much paint and you can successfully get some of those thin lines. Rotate your paper so that your hand and wrist aren't bending in awkward positions to paint these veins. The only reason I'm keeping my paper stationary is for the sake of the video. Otherwise, I would be rotating this leaf in all different directions just to make sure I can get a steady line. Now I've established quite a few of the veins. Now I can actually bring in just a little bit more texture for the next step. So get your veins to a place where you're happy with the contrast. Now I'm going to take some of that red orange. I am going to have it watered down a bit. I like to test my color out on a scrap piece of paper just to make sure it's the value I want. You see this mess I made on the table here? Apparently, my little bracelet dipped into the red paint, and everywhere I went, it dragged the red. So, accident happen. No biggie. So now with this red orange that I've watered down, I'm just going to add some texture to my leaf. So in areas where I feel like there's a little bit more of a darker value, I can just bring a glaze of this color into that area. It's always a little easier to go lighter than you think. But once this color begins to dry, I'll be able to see how light it is. We don't need texture everywhere, but having a little bit, hints of it here and there are really going to help just take your leaf to the next level. I'm just doing little dots and scribbles in areas where I want a little bit of a darker value. Once you're happy with the amount of texture you've created using that watered down red orange, you can choose to then move to your greens or even some of your golden yellows, any additional colors you may feel that you want to add some texture with. Right now, I'm just taking a moment to do a couple dots here and there, little age spots. Now I'm going to go ahead and switch to my green so I can continue glazing some texture on my leaf. So I'm going to water down my green so it's not too intense. I like this value right here. So I'm going to dip my brush in that green, wipe away the excess. And in areas on top of my green where I would like a little bit of a darker texture, I can sparingly add it. Just take your time and don't forget to pause and give your eyes time to interpret the reference photo so you kind of know where you want to go next. It's easy to go on autopilot with a subject like this. But I really love painting leaves because they can be very forgiving and just very relaxing to paint. And that's how you paint a fall leaf. I hope this gets you in the mood for this autumn season, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Please go ahead and leave a comment, like, and subscribe.